and the Republican side of the aisle to acknowledge the mathematical problem.
I know you're reading your talking points. When I interview, hang on, I'm going to answer your question. When I interview,
I think they had ideas, but they were bad ideas. They were bad ideas for America.
Senator, we're a little off topic. I have to let Senator Obama respond.
That because that just
I'll
doesn't.
tell you what the facts are.
Rick, again.
You had the
Rick,
word.
I'm speaking. I'm
Newspaper,
speaking.
the
I'm speaking.
newspaper.
Welcome to this live edition of UCTV Politics. I'm Rebecca Greenberg here with our debaters. Tonight's topic is criminal justice reform. Representing the Democratic side is Bennett Cognato, and representing the Republican side is Christopher Connelly. Let's get started with the opening statements. Chris, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'd also like to thank Bennett, my opponent, for being here, and UCTV for having me. So in today's age, we live in a nation that has 2.2 million Americans now incarcerated, tripled the amount in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. Now, our current 2016 election looks to the presidential candidates for answers. And in reality, many people look for criminal justice reform situations to look for the answer, when in reality, it turns back on the social fabric containing numerous policies that I'll get into detail of later.
All right, Bennett.
Sure. So, yeah, I'd also like to thank Becca and Chris for being here tonight and UCTV for having us. America's very clearly got a prison problem, and we've got 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. It's costing us billions of dollars, but worse than the financial cost is the human cost. We've got sometimes children as young as 13 sentenced to die in prison. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we're ending private prisons. We're rolling back harsh sentencing for nonviolent crimes. We're reinvesting in education and taking that money away from prison structures and understanding that criminals are people first and require rehabilitation. I think that we'll get into some of that tonight.
Well, thank you. Now on to the first question. This one will be for you, Bennett. The United States spends $80 billion a year to keep more than 2 million Americans in jail. Additionally, 1 in 3 American adults have a criminal record. This can make it more difficult for many Americans to find jobs, which can potentially lead to more crime, imprisonment, and increased taxation. Why do you think your party could better handle this immense financial burden? And how do your party's candidates plan on alleviating the strain on taxpayers?
Sure. So I think what we're seeing from the Democratic side is definitely a push to look at the way prison policies affect the average Americans. I think both parties are really ready to look at that. I think the biggest and most significant push comes from candidates like Bernie Sanders, who aren't just saying that we need to reduce the amount of money spent on these prisons, but we need to spend our money more wisely. We need to reinvest in jobs programs for young people who aren't able to find jobs and are more likely to be out committing crimes. And we need to get the private prison money out of campaign finance and out of really the programs that are not serving the needs of criminals in terms of rehabilitation and getting them ready to enter the community again.
Chris?
Well, personally, I view our party's position not only to decrease the prison rate in our nation, but to look at the unemployment factor first. Now, the majority of people that end up in prison usually end up there, one, because they have no other option and they rely on crime to get by as a means of survival. Now, the way to change this is to not just look at the prison aspect of it, but to start with unemployment, and the reason why, even though unemployment in our nation is starting to drop, the reasons why labor participation is at an all-time low.
All right.
Sure. So I would only disagree in terms of, you know, where we stand in terms of the role the actual prisons play and in terms of the prison industry plays in the larger picture here. So, you know, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars funneled into private prisons. They've got quotas and things like that for the beds that they're supposed to have, and even sometimes will advertise recidivism as a profitable business model. So I think getting private prisons out of the picture is one way that Democrats have really been fighting the right battle in terms of prison reform, and I think without getting rid of them, we continue to face a lot of serious issues.
I actually agree with that partially, in the fact that we do need to look to the prisons as a reason to form of rehabilitation, but the problem is right now it's not working. The 2.2 million Americans that are incarcerated currently are put there, as I mentioned before, from reasons of unemployment. the way to lessen the cost of prison costs and to heighten human development in situations like this is to really get to the depths of the reasons why there is such a high or low labor participation within our nation and solve the solutions on that aspect.
All right. Chris, this next question is for you. America constitutes 5% of the world's population, as Bennett said, but has 25% of the world's prisoners. According to the NAACP, from 1980 to 2008, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from 500,000 to 2.3 million, as you also said, Chris. Many believe that the solution to this problem lies in conservative principles, yet others believe that because liberal politicians are more forgiving of things like recreational drug use, they would be most able to fix this problem. Which candidate is most qualified to tackle this issue of mass incarceration, and how will he or she plan on doing so?
Well, currently I think the most obvious candidate who's willing to tackle this problem is Marco Rubio. He's been behind the stance of the war on drugs for countless times right now. Unfortunately, I believe that Jeb Bush was a little stronger in that, but he unfortunately had to drop out to the lack of success. But the next runner-up, Marco Rubio, has constantly fought the war on drugs and believes that even though the 10th Amendment is strong and that the states do have the ability to delegate whether or not, for example, the legalization of marijuana is, allowed within a state, he believes that on a federal level you cannot overturn constitutional amendments such as that due to the fact that the reason why it's banned on the federal level is to act as a deterrent. Is the more we desensitize people to the use of recreational marijuana, just adds to the dangers that lies within the culture behind drugs.
Sure. So it always amazes me to see young people supporting a Tea Party candidate like Marco Rubio, especially when it comes to solving issues like prison reform. I mean, we can talk about the prisons themselves in the ways that, like you said, Chris, that unemployment also factors into susceptibility to commit crimes and things like that. But when you talk about the opportunity and the susceptibility to commit crime, you got to talk about educational opportunities that are available to young people, jobs programs that are available. Are we investing in infrastructure and giving people jobs working in their community? And Marco Rubio isn't interested in doing any of that, and I don't think that kind of ideology is going to help reduce the prison problem in America.
Well, personally, I would just be curious if you could expand on just more at a later period of time why you believe Marco Rubio is not behind that. He's not any type of politician that isn't behind any other human than any other politician is that's on that stage. And as I mentioned before, the reason why he's so strictly against, the federal lifting of the legalization of marijuana is because he cares about our youth, and he doesn't want them to be desensitized about a dangerous substance such as this and just the lackadaisical use of it on, for recreational use. And the reasoning behind that is to look out for our youth, and because he does care about our youth.
Well, unfortunately, we actually have to move on. But we are only getting started here on tonight's debate. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. Welcome back to UCTV Politics. The next question goes to Chris. Data shows that minorities are most affected by incarceration, particularly African Americans, who comprise 1 million of the total incarcerated population. African Americans are incarcerated nearly 6 times the rate of white people. According to a study by Unlocking America, if African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the rates of white people, today's prison and jail populations would decline by 50%. How will candidates from your party approach the obvious racial bias in the criminal justice system?
Well, the verbiage right there obviously bothers me just a little bit off the bat, considering I don't view it quite as obvious in the bias of the system. The numbers do show that it tends to, lean towards minorities, but the reason being obviously has to do with poverty and unemployment. as I tried to mention earlier. When you look at the statistics and numbers behind it, 13% of Americans are African Americans, and 37% of those 13% are committed of murders. And 90% out of those murders are within blacks versus blacks within their own demographic. The reason being is because there is a correlation between minorities and unemployment within our country for whatever reason, and we need to make sure that we pull ahead and include everyone, trying to lessen that gap. And our party would have to work towards the unemployment rather than just the populations that are within the prisons. It's outside the prison that matters, not
Bennett?
Well, I think going back to the idea of unemployment being highest among minority populations and communities of color, again, I think it has to come back down to, when you look at the causes of that, the federal government and local communities not having the resources to invest in education and jobs programs for young people. And I mean, and it gets more serious than that too, and it gets into, you know, systemic racism and the way that the police force functions when it's not reflective of the community that it serves. In 2014, police killed 253 unarmed people, and 91 people were just stopped for traffic violations. So we've really got to look at the way that violence plays into this structurally, I think.
Chris?
I actually do agree with that point, looking within the violence. The only point I was trying to make that violence is directly correlated with, you know, poverty and the unemployment. The only way to fix that is by trying to, you know, decrease the gap between unemployment and labor participation. And the reason why I brought up Marco Rubio earlier is because he is an advocate for that, and that's what I believe is behind my party.
Well, I think every candidate on either side of the party is for reducing unemployment and for, you know, getting people out of poverty. But when it comes to the solutions to poverty and the solutions to unemployment, I think you've got to invest in a $15 minimum wage. You've got to invest in publicly funded jobs programs to rebuild our infrastructure, even to maintain public parks and things like that. If you look at the social programs of FDR, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that kind of thing, we can reduce the number of people in prison if we increase the number of people working by investing in communities and jobs and programs like that.
Well, just to stop you right there, it's one of the biggest assets of our economy is the small businesses, and as you mentioned, increasing a minimum wage to $15 an hour isn't going to just jumpstart the economy by giving people more jobs. Just because you increase the minimum wage doesn't directly correlate to more jobs. If you look at the economics behind it, if you increase the wage behind labor to $15 an hour, companies are going to hire less people just because they don't have the money backing their businesses to cover the labor costs behind it.
Sorry, we have to move on to the next question. Bennett, this one is for you. Governor John Kasich has implemented a ban the box policy, which removes the requirement that people with records disclose their criminal records when applying for government jobs. Do you think that this policy is productive, or should there always be full disclosure when applying for jobs?
Well, obviously there should be full disclosure of anything that applies to a company's ability to hire employees who are suited for those positions. Obviously, we don't want someone who is convicted of a murder doing door-to-door sales. But what the Ban the Box program really comes down to is saying, well, do we need to indicate every single conviction this person has had right off the bat in their sort of application to application to an employer? So they should be able to get an interview first based on their qualifications and skills before they have to disclose that, or have a chance to be able to explain what happened and why they're still a suitable employee for the position. So I would support a Ban the Box policy because I don't think it necessarily means no disclosure.
Chris?
Going off of the disclosure factor, the Ban the Box principle doesn't hold much productivity behind it in all sense. Personally, I have seen by working within minimum wage atmospheres that the people that work behind those jobs usually aren't of the highest ethical standards. People can get interviews behind jobs at those levels just because that they have a criminal record doesn't mean they're not going to be able to get jobs. Sure, they might not be able to get a personal job selling stuff door to door, but there are outlets and are jobs available for people who have criminal records. There are industries for people like that they can have a standard of living and be able to participate in labor.
Bennett?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think when you talk about ethical standards, I think you gotta be willing to acknowledge that sometimes these people that are convicted of crimes that keep them out of getting jobs can be things as simple as drug possession, right? So when you consider the fact that today's criminals are tomorrow's neighbors, right? I mean, 600,000 people a year being released from prison. We've got to have the programs and resources for these people to engage with their community, be able to get jobs that aren't these bottom of the barrel opportunities for them to do unskilled labor in every single instance. And because that's who we are as a country. I mean, we shouldn't be saying just because you've had a conviction for some crime that you have no chance of getting a good job ever again. I think that's what the ban the box policy is about.
I agree with you in the fact that everyone deserves to have a good job, but you stating that, as you said, people who would be charged with possession of drugs don't correlate with high ethical standards. Are you saying that people that are convicted of drugs possession doesn't have any effect on the morality as a human being, or what was the point behind that?
Well, we actually have to move on to the next question, but you will get to address his question right about now. And Chris, this last one is for you. Marijuana has been legalized in several states throughout the country, including Washington and Colorado. However, according to NBC, roughly 40,000 inmates have a current conviction involving the recreational drug. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, a criminal history built on minor marijuana convictions can categorize defendants as career criminals for sentencing purposes in subsequent cases, thereby triggering harsh mandatory sentences. However, one concern for decriminalization of marijuana is that it will result in greater use of the drug. How do candidates from your respective parties approach legalization and decriminalization of marijuana?
Well, I think the end of that question actually addressed the majority of that answer. Concerning like mandatory minimums and how in Connecticut we have decriminalized the use of recreational marijuana, obviously that doesn't deter people as much as having strict laws behind drug possession and recreational use. If you, say for Connecticut, if you have under 1 ounce of cannabis, you only are charged a fine of $150. And of course, if you're a repeat offender, those charges get escalated. But do you really think anyone is going to be deterred from going around and using recreational drugs if the worst they could face if they have underneath, a certain amount of drugs is just a $150 fine? The whole point of prison is to deter crime from happening, and if there's no deterrent behind it, how is there going to be a stoppage of crime?
Bennett?
Sure. So, I mean, taking a step back there, I mean, the war on drugs costs $51 billion annually, right? So we've got young people in prison for possessing marijuana when we have no studies to suggest that marijuana is any more harmful than cigarettes or alcohol. In fact, that alcohol and cigarettes are far more harmful, and the cigarette lobby contributes hundreds of thousands of dollars to congressmen every year. So there's no problem there, which, I really don't understand. Especially when, you look at a case like Colorado, who legalized recreational marijuana and saw no continuing increase in usage and generated $76 million in additional tax revenue. So I think the case is very clear that we need to legalize cannabis in this country federally.
Chris?
Going off of that, just as one thing, you can increase a lot of revenue within taxes just by the use of medical marijuana, which my party have nothing against. Medical marijuana is beneficial to not only medical patients, but the economy as a whole, allowing people to open up medical marijuana shops as long as they have the proper license and permits behind it. But the whole point being is that using drugs and recreational use in the war on drugs doesn't just include cannabis. It includes, heroin, the heroin epidemic in New Jersey. Those costs also goes to things like that. And you're stating that those costs aren't worth trying to save people's lives from the heroin epidemic that's in New Jersey. I don't really see the point behind that.
No, I mean, I didn't mention heroin, so obviously I'm very against legalizing heroin. What I'm in favor of is not putting people in prison for addiction, right? So when we talk about cannabis and we talk about heroin, I think they're two very different drugs, right? So, if someone can use cannabis and not nearly be as affected as they are by, abuse of alcohol or cigarettes over a long-term period, then there really doesn't seem to be a viable reason for the state to be spending as much money as it is putting people in jail for marijuana, especially when it disproportionately affects communities of color.
Just an example behind the dangers of recreational use of marijuana. There's no current way to test the ability of how high someone is currently at the time. And you're talking about how alcohol and the use of cigarettes aren't as dangerous at the time. There's a breathalyzer test for alcohol. You can see how intoxicated someone is behind the wheel of a motor vehicle. There is no current, viable way to test the ability how incapacitated someone is behind the wheel. And if that isn't something that's dangerous to consider when legalizing the recreational use of marijuana, I don't know what is.
Unfortunately, we do have to move on. But before we sign off for tonight, let's move on to closing statements. Since Chris went first with the opening statements, we'll have Bennett start.
Sure. So I want to start again by acknowledging the figures that we heard in the beginning, that the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. And it's an enormous problem, and it ties into a lot of different variables, right? So what we've got to do is really reform the prison industry from the top down. And a lot of those suggestions we've seen from the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the Campaign Zero policy movement, which has a lot of really modest but effective ways that we can be reforming the prison industry in America to get rid of private prisons that run off of these corrupt campaign donations, and move to a system where we focus on rehabilitation. We focus on, acknowledging that crimes have been committed and getting people to work back into their communities in a ways that works for everybody and doesn't drain our tax base. I want to thank UCTV for having me here tonight. Thanks, Chris and Becca as well. And thanks for being here. It's been a good debate.
Well, as I'll go off of what Bennett mentioned in the ending of his closing statement, talking about the fact that we do need more funds addressed to programs such as finding jobs for the unemployed, and programs as such against drug addiction and education programs. The only way to actually do that is to lower the cost of prison costs, and that doesn't necessarily have to come from prison reforms. And as I mentioned before, being able to lower the poverty rates and lower unemployment even more than it already is, but truly lower increase labor participation. In the end of the day, if you focus the efforts towards the economy and decrease poverty, in the end you will decrease crime. And going off of a couple of my final points, ignoring the fact of mandatory minimums and allowing the continuation of the legalization of recreational drugs is only going to add on to the fact of that our country is slowly slipping into a dangerous path of demoralized standings within our own country. And we need to make sure we focus our values on the people and not just let them fade away without help. Sorry.
Well, that's it for tonight's debate. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great night.